My name is Howard Shimokura. I was born in Vancouver, 1938, July 7th, 1938. My family was, of course, my father, uh, who came from Hiroshima, Japan, at a very young age. He landed in Canada when he was 11 in 1915. And my father always used to tell us as children when we were growing up about how life was for him when he first came. Probably the most memorable experience that he talked about was going into grade 1 at 11 years old, knowing nothing. Of course, he had some schooling in Japan, in Japanese, but he knew very little, if any, English when he started at 11. But what I find remarkable about his life is that he was able to overcome, in a sense that he mastered English and completed high school in 1924, so 9 years of schooling at high school level. Then he went to university for, he graduated as in medicine from the University of Toronto in 1932. So that gives you some idea of the time, about 8 years of university, secondary and schooling. My mother, on the other hand, was born in Vancouver, so she grew up in Paul Street environment. Her father was a doctor who was trained in Japan and came to Canada in 1901. And for the better part of 40 years was a medical doctor who practiced in the Japanese community in and around Paul Street. She, I think, I don't have proof of this, but I think she went to Strathcona. But I do know that she graduated from high school in the late 1920s from King Edward High School, which is no longer there, but she was a graduate of that institution. And they married in 1936, and I came along in 1938. So that's a brief history of my parents. Well, I've got two brothers, the three brothers in the family. I'm the oldest. I have a brother, Alan, who was born in 1943 in Tashme, actually. And I have my youngest brother was born in a town called Raymond in Alberta in 1947. So there are three boys in the family. Well, I do have snippets of memory about life in Vancouver prior to internment. We lived in a house on Nanaimo Street, 268 Nanaimo Street. I recall that. I recognize the house, but more than that, I guess there were some photos of taken in front of the house with the number of the house clearly marked, so that's how I know. I had friends who lived around me. On both sides there were children, and I have vague memories of playing with them as a youngster, but I was, like only 4 years old, so there's not a heck of a lot I remember. But I do remember one family had a boy and a girl and a dog, and I really had fun playing with them because I really had fun with the dog, I remember. I also have memories of the neighborhood a bit, in that on one occasion especially, when my mother took me to the local wading pool, and somehow or other, this is from her now, because I don't have a memory of this actually happening, but I fell in the waiting pool, and my mother had to rush in and clothes and all, pull me out. I don't know how deep it was, but anyway, it was she tells me that it was a very traumatic experience for her. So that's I do have sort of snippets of that, and but other than that, that's basically it. It was a they're positive, fun type memories I have of that time. My first language, I had some Japanese, but I'd have to say that my first language was English. And I can't account for that except the fact that my parents, I think, probably decided between them that I should learn English first, for the obvious reasons, I think. But I did have some Japanese, and one story I've been told, I don't recall this at all, but when my grandmother passed away, I was a little kid running around actually, saying, my grandmother died. Oba-chan, she shinde, I guess, or something like that. I can't remember it now exactly what it is, but I was told that's what I did. So I knew some Japanese, but actually Japanese has never been anything that I would be able to use in a conversational way with in general. When he was growing up as a youngster, he lived on it pretty much on his own, as I understand it, in that he was a houseboy, which was a very typical thing for young Japanese boys, especially, who came to Canada, and so he lived with a family in the Kerrisdale area of Vancouver now. I do know that in his later years, he educationally, high school, middle school and high school, he attended Prince of Wales, which is now a different name. Prince of Wales today is different from Prince of Wales when my father went to school. The school now is called Shaughnessy School. But it was Prince of Wales at the time that he was going there. And he was living with a family nearby, I presume. I remember the last name of the family was Norman. So, but that's about it that from everything I've learned about my father, that's the only thing about the houseboy experience he had, was living with his family, whose last name was Norman. I have no memory at all of exactly what happened when the war actually broke out. And I don't recall anything about the sort of the trauma that my parents must have experienced. I do have recollections of blackouts that we were all, it was imposed on us. And I do know that we traveled to Tashmeet. We didn't go through Hastings Park because we were living in Vancouver already. We drove to Tashmeet. My father was allowed to keep his car, and I have copies, in fact the original permit papers that say that he was permitted to keep his automobile for reasons of, as a doctor, to be able to carry or transport patients in a case where there might be a reason for them to be moved from Tashmeet to Vancouver, let's say. So he was allowed to keep his automobile, and we drove that car to Tashmeet in September of 1942. Now, life in Tashmeet, for me as a child, was I was totally oblivious, I would have to say, about the reasons for being there. I just followed my parents and did what I was told, and grew up, spent 4 years in Tashme, 3 years of going to school, kindergarten and grade 1 and grade 2 in Tashme. And outside of school, what I remember was that it was like being at a summer camp in a way, although during the winter months it was pretty cold and lots of snow. But I recall a lot about the summers, which were in essence being outside and playing with other children and having a great time. It was so my memories of Tashme were generally positive, I would say, in terms of not having anything to worry about, and nothing traumatic happened to me. So it was a fun time. Community life for me was, as a young kid again, well, I look forward to the things that were fun. There were many sort of recreational activities organized by the people in Tashme for the benefit of the community, because Tashme was so isolated. There were, for example, there were movies that were put on by a very dedicated citizen, a resident, I guess, of Tashme, who had a collection of movies that he took the time and trouble to present to the community as his way of contributing to life in Tashme. I remember the sporting events, baseball particularly during the summers, but there was also basketball and even some hockey that was played in Tashme that I have memories of seeing. And of course there was a very active Boy Scout organization, and a very large one in fact. And they had all kinds of activities that I wasn't able to participate in because I was too young, but I remember events that they would have. And what else? I guess one of the problems I had when I was living in Tashme was that I lived in a home that was built especially for my family, which was very close to the hospital for obvious reasons, but it was away from the community in general. So there was some distance, although it seemed like a long, today I know it's very short distance, but at the time I was growing up, it was a bit of a barrier in terms of my being able to play with other children. They were 3 or 4 blocks away, is how I would put it now. And so it was not convenient, or it was not like living in the community where friends were next door. And so I didn't really have the sort of life growing up with close friends, because they were not close. The other thing I do remember is that Tashme had Japanese public baths, and going to these baths were like going to it was kind of fun, because it was big pool of water. It was almost like a swimming pool kind of thing, as I recall. My mother was brought up in a very traditional Japanese family, but we would have a lot of Japanese cuisine, food, but also sort of Western style meals as well. So it would depend. 2 or 3 times a week it would be. It was a mix of both Western and Japanese cuisine. Well, rice was yes, rice was always a constant whenever we had a Japanese meal. But then there would be other things. I remember bologna and sort of the things that and vegetables of various kinds that were prepared in a Japanese style. But also remember macaroni and cheese and ham and eggs whenever we got eggs. And gosh, I can't, no, I don't know, I can't really be more specific than that. I imagine we had fish and beef and other things that were generally, whatever was available actually, because the selection of things from the store was not the kind of thing you find today in today's supermarkets. So there were limitations. Another thing I remember distinctly was that milk was not readily available, the traditional milk that we buy today. So my mother would prepare either powdered milk or mix water with condensed milk, and that was milk. And there was something called clim, which is milk spelled backwards. It was sold in stores as a powder that you'd mix with water, and that would be milk. The Tashme camp closed around August of 1946, and families, one at a time, more or less, moved away to other places. And I should also mention that throughout the life in Tashme, there was a small stream of people who moved to jobs and opportunities in Eastern Canada. So by the time the camp closed, it was the population had dropped quite a bit already. So when the camp was closed finally, my family decided, because we had a choice, the choices were to go to Japan or to go east of the Rockies, and we chose to go to Alberta. First to Raymond in 1946, and while in Alberta we moved from Raymond to Lethbridge in 1947, and in '51 we returned as a family to Vancouver. Now while we were in Alberta, I went through grade 3 to grade 7, and schooling was very traditional Canadian schooling at the time. I should maybe say a few words about living in Alberta first. Alberta was, I found, I guess my parents were a little concerned about this, but I certainly experienced a bit of animosity towards Japanese because we were Japanese. But my understanding is, from looking back at it now, it was much worse in British Columbia than it was in Alberta. I do recall a couple of instances where there were, it wasn't called name calling so much as being ostracized in a way. A couple of my friends said, I can't play with you because you're Japanese. And so this happened once or twice, particularly in Lethbridge. And but I knew what it was. I knew the sense that Japan was still not an enemy so much as undesirable people or something. So I had contact with that sort of thing in Alberta. And when we came back to Vancouver, I was worried. I can say now that at the time I was very apprehensive about that sort of thing continuing, or maybe even worse, because being in British Columbia was, as I understand it anyway, the feeling of anti-Japanese was much stronger. And I did experience it. Especially. Not especially, but there were times when there was a lot of sort of name calling, and not even sure about this, but being told that I didn't belong and I should go back to Japan or something like that. But anyway, I was somewhat prepared for it because I'd experienced it in Alberta, and something I had to just deal with. You have to. There was no choice but to accept what was going on and make the best of the situation. There were. I certainly recall feeling very sort of welcomed by having friends that I made very quickly with other Japanese when I went to Japanese language school. I was my father insisted that I go, and I did, and that's how I met many of the friends I still have today. And it kind of introduced me to to a group of people who were had similar experiences to what I had, so there was an affinity right away. And very quickly I formed friendships, and I recall I made friends with non-Japanese as well at school. It's a normal thing. But for several years, I had two sets of friends, you might say. My friends from Japanese language school and my friends from, the regular school. And there wasn't a lot of crossover. I had a couple of school friends from public school who I introduced to my Japanese friends, and we got along very, very well. But there weren't very many, and so my social life was bifurcated in a way, in that I had two sets of friends, and that went on for throughout high school actually. And one of the things I tell people about this is that that one of the very first things you ask of your Japanese friends is, where were you interned? And it was always a conversation starter. It was a regular thing. You just normally you'd be asked that question too. So other Japanese people of the same age had the same issue, I guess, of wanting to belong, and this was a good way to get a conversation going. So where were you interned? University was another situation, of course, where I had, again, my two sets of friends continued. Not everybody went to university, but I still sort of maintained, or at least this business of having two sets of friends didn't change much going to UBC. And you meet people that you find, you develop a friendship with, and again, there's two sets of friends. There were a lot of Niseis primarily who were at UBC that I got to know, and there were social occasions for I guess in both sets of friends. There was an organization that preceded me. There were, I don't know how many years before I got there, but there was something called the Nisei Varsity Club, which I joined immediately, and it was very much a center of social life at UBC among the Japanese friends I had. So that worked out really well. I really had a wonderful time with that group, and I have friends from that I still have today. All throughout high school, this friendship among the Japanese was very strong, I would say. That we as a group did things together, and parties, and just hanging out, and doing things on weekends together. And and this, I'm sure it went on with all the Japanese kids of the same age. And so we had our own sort of parties and things, and we organized events and so on, and that continued for, throughout the university years anyway. Now, when I finished, got my degree and finished school, I married just before I graduated, and my first job was in Ottawa. So my wife and I left Vancouver in 1963, drove across Canada in a beat-up old VW Bug with all our worldly possessions in it. It took us almost a week to do that, and it was in the middle of February, so the weather in Vancouver was wonderful, but the weather across Canada was not so wonderful. I recall having a few problems getting through the Rockies, first of all, and then across the prairies, and then northern Ontario. And we arrived in Ottawa right after a very, very bad snowstorm, I remember, and thinking and talking to my wife, what the heck are we doing here? Because the weather was terrible, and we had no winter clothes, and it was just awful. So that first spring was quite an experience, because we had to find a place to live and buy all sorts of things, clothes and furniture and all that sort of thing. So it took a while to get settled, and but we made it. And looking back now, it's although it was very tough at the time, it was life experience. In Ottawa, it's a government town, as you well know, and but there were a number of Niseis who worked there. They had government jobs mostly, and again we fell in with a Japanese group, and so again this idea of two sets of friends continued, and the community was. The Japanese community was semi-organized, and so they had things. But what really got things going in terms of cohesion among the Japanese in Ottawa was redress. And my wife was very active in the group that was formed to address the redress issue. And I remember, lots of discussions about whether or not we should go for individual compensation or group compensation, which, as you know, was a very controversial issue. And so that went on. But before the actual redress happened, which was in 1988, we moved. We moved from Ottawa in '84 to North Carolina as part of my job. And that put us into a completely new circumstance where there were no Japanese to speak of. And so my connection to Japanese people, at least, was changed, I would say drastically. And we maintained friendships, of course, but by, over distance. So I, from that point on, until I returned back to Vancouver in 2002, I was in a completely non-Japanese environment, as working and socially as well. So we lost, or at least I can't say we lost. I guess we were separated from our Japanese heritage for a good part of that time, 84 to 2002. Um, the only connection I had with Japanese through that period was, being able to buy Japanese foods at the, local Asian food store. And so food has always been a constant, I guess, in terms of maintaining connection to Japan. My connection to Japanese heritage and culture at this point in my life is very different than it has been for much of my life, because I've been in and out of the sort of Japanese, or connection to Japanese people, basically. As I've said, for many, many years, I was completely cut off, you might say, from Japanese culture, in the sense of having people that I interacted with socially, because there weren't any other Japanese. So, I still have strong feelings about Japan and Japanese culture, because it's heritage, it's my heritage. I still have very strong feelings about the cuisine. I mean, I love Japanese food, for example, still, and probably will never lose that. I have interest in sort of things that are Japanese. So I'm always interested in learning about prominent Japanese people, entertainers or sports or politicians or whatever is going on in Japan relative to the world. I'm interested in. So I try to keep up with that sort of thing. For years, I collected Japanese stamps as a hobby, and it was a connection that I felt strong about. And so whenever there was any news about something that somebody who's Japanese, accomplished or did, I picked up on that. And even when I was living in the U.S., which I did for a good part of my life, there were Japanese Americans who played prominent roles in this, that, and the other thing that I was interested in. So I've maintained a connection that way. Now, language, on the other hand, was something that I had lots of trouble with, in the sense that I never did really develop an ability in conversation. Even through my Japanese school training, the conversation was not emphasized. At least I felt that way, and I never really did learn enough Japanese conversation to carry on a decent conversation. So I would avoid that. When I was working, I had opportunities to spend time in Japan, but I never used any Japanese conversation. I could read, sufficient to get around in terms of travel, but I never used a language to speak very much. My Japanese conversation was very, very poor, so I never used it. So I would say, though, that even as I lived my life, what I learned in Japanese school, I've lost. I would have to say that I've lost a good part of it. I can still read very, primitive, or at least simple Japanese, but it's certainly nowhere near the level that I was able to do when I was going to Japanese language school. Well, my contact with the country of Japan, I've been, part of my job for 3 or 4 years was traveling to Japan on business. I think I made maybe 20 trips to Japan over a period of 2 or 3 years, sometimes for a week, sometimes for 2 or 3 months. And but it was all contact with Japanese who, with whom I spoke English. They understood, and they were gracious enough to accommodate me, knowing that my Japanese was very poor. So we never even tried. At least I learned very quickly that if I tried, it would soon get me into lots of trouble. So I avoided that by just saying I didn't speak Japanese. And it worked out very well, actually. Most people in the scientific or engineering field, which I was in, were very proficient in English. These are some photographs of me and my father and my grandfather, who were members of the school board. I, of course, was not. I was a student. But here I am in this picture right here. And in this photo of a school board, my father there. This is a picture of the student and teacher organization at the Japanese language school, taken in 1955, and my finger is pointing at me in the picture. This is a picture of the school board, and it's my father right there at the end of my finger. And let's see, I think there's probably another photo I'd just like to point out, if I can find it. Yeah, oh, okay. First one was me. This is 53. The picture of my father was taken in 1954, this one here. And you've got the page, I think. Oh, maybe not. This photo was taken in, I think, 1939. I'm not sure exactly of that, but 1939 is what I believe. And in it are my grandfather, Dr. Ishiwara, right there. And I think my father was in this photo as well, although I can't find him immediately. No. That's it.